Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience and thank you for arriving on time. Welcome, everyone, to the 30 by 30 Advisory Committee virtual meeting. We're going to get started in just a minute. Welcome to the 30 by 30 Advisory Committee virtual meeting. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're get started right now, although I see some folks are continuing to join. We want to respect folks' time, so we're going to get started. The purpose of this meeting is for the Advisory Committee to present ideas and recommendations for the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy and its implementation to the California Natural Resources Agency, or CNRA. Today's meeting will feature an overview of the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy, ways in which the public can provide feedback on the document, and a discussion of ideas and recommendations from the 30 by 30 Advisory Committee. My name is Debbie Schechter, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. We'd like to start with some housekeeping items and tips for a successful workshop. First, the meeting will be recorded for future viewing and will be posted on the website www.californianature.ca.gov. We're also streaming the workshop live on the CNRA YouTube page. The meeting is being interpreted in Spanish. In order to access the audio channel for Spanish, you'll need to click the interpretation button, which is the globe icon in the Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screen. And that button will appear after these instructions once we start the interpretation. These instructions will be repeated in Spanish, and then you'll be able to join the Spanish language audio channel. I'd like to invite our interpreter, Victor Hernandez, to repeat these instructions in Spanish.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. Muy buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Les queremos dejar saber que esta reunión será interpretada en el español. Para poder acceder a lo que es el canal de audio, usted tendrá que hacer clic en lo que es el botón de interpretación, que es un icono del globo o un mundo en la barra de tareas en su plataforma de Zoom. Después aparecerá un menú y entonces podrá usted seleccionar el idioma. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Now we invite participants to join the interpretation audio channel by clicking that globe icon in the Zoom taskbar. We are also providing closed captioning. If you'd like to use this option, please click the closed caption icon in the Zoom taskbar, and then you can select subtitles to view subtitles on the screen, or live transcript to see the full transcript in the side panel. During the meeting, participants will be muted, and we ask that you please stay muted. We also ask that you use the chat feature only for technical assistance. If you need technical assistance, please use the chat feature. You also can use the raise hand feature to signal that you need technical support. If you're participating on the phone, you can dial *9 to get support. We also will share relevant links and information in the meeting through using the chat feature. We've inserted a link in the chat to an agenda that you can follow for today's meeting. And here is the agenda. We will hear a brief presentation outlining key elements of the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 document and CA nature. We'll provide an update on how the public can provide feedback on the draft document and participate in a future virtual meeting. The advisory committee will be introduced and they'll have a discussion of ideas and recommendations for implementation of 30 by 30. And then CNRA representatives will have a discussion with the committee. And the meeting will end by 5 p.m. Now I'd like to turn it over to Secretary Wade Crowfoot from the California Natural Resources Agency for some opening remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Debbie. This is a really exciting moment from my perspective in this effort. 30 by 30 is part of an international movement to do better conserving land, waters across the planet for the benefit of us, people, and all nature and life forms. In California, Governor Newsom set a target through executive order over a year ago to conserve 30% of our land and coastal waters by 2030. And further directed our agency to develop a strategy to achieve that target. That target was based on leadership that was displayed through our legislature and through groups that are working to improve environmental conservation across the state. We think that 30 by 30 and achieving 30 by 30 will support our state's efforts to combat climate change and build our resilience to climate impacts, that it can and should expand access to the outdoors and nature with a specific focus on equitable access, providing expanded access to those people who don't have enough access. And thirdly, to protect our incredible natural richness and biodiversity in California. This Pathways document is the first crack at the strategy of how we're going to achieve this ambitious, but we believe achievable target. To inform the draft that we'll talk about today, I'm really proud that our team did what I consider to be very expansive outreach and engagement. We conducted 10 regional workshops, albeit virtual given the pandemic, across the state to zero in on challenges and opportunities for this effort in different parts of the state. We had over 60 either formal government-to-government consultations with tribal governments or more informal conversations with tribal communities to inform this. And then we held last year several thematic focused panels on components of 30 by 30, including how 30 by 30 can advance equity or address biodiversity and how it can be implemented and what its impacts would be on coastal waters. The group that's formed here, this advisory committee, we are very thankful for. You all represent a cross-section of leaders with different experiences, different types and levels of expertise on these topics, and really, from our perspective, a cross-section of insight that will help facilitate improvements to this draft. We are very open-minded around how we can take this draft strategy and refine it and improve it before finalizing it as our roadmap to achieve 30 by 30. So we look forward to your frank, your candid discussion around where we can and how we can strengthen this strategy, answering your questions, and supporting this open and constructive dialogue. As Debbie mentioned, there are plenty of different ways that members of the public can provide detailed input for the plan, and we'll welcome that and take that into close consideration. And I'm looking forward to Debbie providing, opportunities or identifying opportunities to do that. Overall, just big thanks for you all engaging in this. While our agency is putting together, spearheading this strategy, it's an effort across our state government. And frankly, we hope it's an action plan that's really catalyzes a movement across California. Many of you that are probably joining today, and certainly members of the committee, are the reason that we're here because of your leadership and vision over the years that really led to this effort. So many thanks for the opportunity to share perspective, and good luck in your discussion today.
I'm going to take it over. Thanks so much, Secretary Crowfoot. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for all of your help getting us to this point. My name is Jennifer Norris. I am the Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the Resources Agency. I want to take a minute to thank the team who helped draft this document, who helped us build CA Nature, and everyone who helped put all these workshops on over this last year. I get to take a lot of credit for the efforts of so many at this moment, and I just want to say thank you to all of you. I'm joined today by Mark Gold, my partner on the salty side, I like to say. He and I have worked together very closely developing this draft, and we'll work together through implementation of 30 by 30. Mark is our Deputy Secretary for Coasts and Oceans, and the Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council. So together, we're going to provide an overview quickly of the materials we currently have out for public feedback. So as the Secretary noted, we released the draft document of the Pathways to 30 by 30, Accelerating Conservation of California's Nature. We delivered that on December 15th. And today I'm going to focus on just 4 pieces of this document and then talk a little bit about CA Nature. So our conservation framework, the definition of conservation, the strategies and actions, and our vision for implementation. So the document begins by establishing a conservation framework. And I think this is really important. It sets the table for why we're doing what we're doing and how we want to do this moving forward. Our 3 key objectives, and these are straight out of the executive order that the Secretary referenced, signed over a year ago, are to protect biodiversity, expand access to nature, and to mitigate and build resilience to climate change. I want to note that we really think that conservation of lands and coastal waters can help us drive on all 3 of these objectives. And 30 by 30 complements important efforts underway, including the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Land Strategy, which outlines a suite of actions that can be taken across all lands to sequester carbon, as well as build resilience to the effects of climate change. We have a newly launched Access for All initiative, which is going to kick off a series of listening sessions and develop a roadmap for how to improve access for all Californians in all sectors. And we have an ongoing biodiversity initiative that the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Food and Agriculture have been implementing for years. All of those initiatives go into a lot more detail about how to achieve these objectives. And 30 by 30 tries to bring those together into one place. Our conservation framework also includes key core commitments, because we know there are overriding principles that must flow through all of our work at every level. And these are to work to achieve justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, to strengthen our tribal partnerships, and to protect our economic prosperity, clean energy resources, and our food supply. And I will say that in both the key objectives and the core commitments, we provide some detail on that and what we think that means. We really welcome your feedback. The document also provides a definition of conservation. And here it is: land and coastal water areas that are durably protected and managed to support functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the species that rely on them. If you want to count something, you have to know what you're counting. And I will tell you that we agonized over these words. We basically had to find words that describe nature. So here it is. And then after this paragraph, we go on for several pages to provide sections, provide examples of what that means, explanations of how that definition shows up on maps. I want to make clear, though, that things that don't meet this definition are still really important to our key objectives. Places that are well managed and sequester lots of carbon, for example, but maybe don't have durable protections, those really still help us with climate change. Or maybe an open space that provides great access to the outdoors, but maybe less so for nature. Those things are all important. But for 30 by 30, we have a sort of tighter set of objectives, and that's what this definition is intended to illustrate. So what does this look like for lands? Well, it really includes a broad range of landscapes, from very strict wilderness to working ranches and regional open spaces. And based on our definition, we think about 24% of the state's lands are already conserved. The way this shows up on maps, we use existing classifications from the United States Geological Survey, the so-called Protected Areas Database. Now, why do we do that? Main reason, we already have it. It's fairly comprehensive and we think it works. But we want to hear from you if you have better ideas. And I think the committee might have some thoughts on that. Because we note that these classifications don't pick up smaller areas or places that might not be protected in traditional ways. So also in our definition, we point out that more work needs to be done for those other effective conservation measures. I wrote some inconsistencies on the slide, so I don't forget to say this. We are aware of several areas that appear to meet our textual definition of conservation, but are not currently showing up on our map as counted as conserved. So on our website and in the notice for this meeting, we provide information on how you can initiate a review of those lands that might be in that situation. So please make note of that. I'm going to pitch it over to Mark to talk about our coastal waters definition and how that shows up.
All right, thanks, Jen. So as you've heard previously from Jennifer Norris's presentation, on the ocean side, marine protected areas, there's really no debate on whether or not MPAs meet the definition. And so that I think is just important for everybody to know. And that doesn't mean it has to be a no-take MPA. It could be a limited take MPA with commercial restrictions, fishing restrictions, or sport fishing restrictions. All the MPAs we're pretty much looking at in that manner is already getting us to the 16%. Now, the other thing going on, which for those of you who've seen me and Jen talk about this before, I'm going to repeat myself, which is we're doing this decadal review of our MPA network. And this is a really important process. Millions of dollars have been invested into the Marine Protected Area Network, not only establishing that network, but also putting together the monitoring program and the research program to determine how well the network is actually working. Our promise to everybody in the conservation and the fishing community was that we would not conflate these two processes. And so that decadal review is in process, should be completed probably the beginning of next year is where we're looking at right now on pace. So you have our commitment from CNRA that what we're talking about on how to get the additional 14% to get to 30 by 30. We're not looking at the network of MPAs at this time. It doesn't mean that at no time, 3 years down the line, et cetera, that those discussions may not be had. But you have our commitment that we're not saying, oh, we're at 16% today, we're going to be at 30% MPAs by 2030. That is not what we're doing here. So what are we looking at? Well, the biggest opportunity here that really makes the most sense in light of President Biden and the administration also making their federal commitment of 30 by 30 for land and sea, is the fact that we have this incredible group of national marine sanctuaries along our coast here. So whether it's the Farallones or Monterey Bay or the Channel Islands, and there's a proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, there's more than enough coastal waters there to have discussions of what can we do for additional conservation to really conserve biodiversity within those areas. Just as a reminder to everybody, national marine sanctuaries, when it comes to protection, already has the protection of not allowing mineral extraction, no offshore oil, no seabed mining, those sorts of things. But there aren't within the national marine sanctuaries any requirements to reduce or eliminate fishing pressures. And so just keep that in mind. So the sorts of things that we're talking about that we really look forward to discussing with the national marine sanctuaries and partnering with the feds and all the stakeholders as part of those processes are everything from pollution prevention requirements, really reducing the amount of pollution going into those areas, Speed limits for large vessels to protect cetaceans would be another example. Permanent management measures for fisheries, maybe gear type prohibitions that already exist and making them permanent. So there's a wide variety of different things that we're looking at for national marine sanctuaries. And we'd love to hear more ideas from you, the public, on what else we can do. And we received many of those in the last couple of months. And thank you so much for that. With that, I'll pass it back to Jen.
Thanks, Mark. So the bulk of the document, about 30 pages, is our set of strategic actions, our so-called pathways to 30 by 30. These are a compilation of what we heard from you that is working. So this is everything from acquisitions and easements to advanced mitigation, working with our federal partners, as Mark talked about, the need for science and stewardship. Please take a look at those actions, give us your thoughts on those. And then finally, the document starts the conversation about implementation. And this is really where the panel comes in and you. Next slide, please. We really need your thoughts on how to operationalize all of this in a way that is locally driven, yet meaningfully supported by the state. We take a crack at outlining our thoughts. We know we're committed to collaboration. We're really interested in working with our regional stakeholders and working groups. Of course, tribal partners are essential to this process. We definitely want to continue to work with the California Biodiversity Council that provides such important interagency coordination, and the California Biodiversity Network, where academics and practitioners are doing some of the deep work on how this can really be operationalized. So we know that's out there. We've put some ideas on paper, but we're really looking for your thoughts. We also identify some early and really significant investments that are going to drive on these priorities. $758 million for nature-based solutions. This is in a set aside. We'll be providing detail about how we plan to spend that very soon in coming months. There's $600 million for coastal resilience projects, $645 million for habitat restoration, another $105 million for wildlife corridors and fish passage projects. These are really going to provide an important down payment and kickstart to this process, and I think going to really help us move us down the road meaningfully on 30 by 30. Finally, we shared on December 15th an early look at CA Nature Geographic Information System. This is my personal dream come true. I'm so excited about this. I hope you will check it out and play around. This is a web-based system, really, and there are multiple levels of complexity, from just really straightforward, what am I looking at here, to the folks that want to download data and play with them. We have a dashboard that's going to track our progress toward our goal. Super exciting. And coming soon, we'll have some decision support applications that will help us really identify the best places on the landscape where we can advance access, protect biodiversity, and meet our climate objectives. So check out CA Nature GIS and look for a fully functional system in a couple more months. But some really cool stuff is already out there. And with that, I think I will turn it back to Debbie to talk about opportunities for you to provide your feedback.
Great, thanks, Jen. As you heard from Secretary Crowfoot, from Jen, and from Mark, public participation and feedback is critical to this project and the process. And while today is focused on input and feedback from the advisory committee, there are many ways that you, the public, can provide your feedback. CNRA is offering a 60-day public review and feedback period for the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 document. And you're invited to provide your comments through February 15th. The ways that you can submit your feedback are via email at californianature@resources.ca.gov, via regular mail, or you can leave a voice message at this number, 1-800-417-0668. Also, CNRA will be hosting a virtual public meeting to solicit public feedback and comments on the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 document on Tuesday, February 1st from 3 to 6 p.m. And we invite you to pre-register for this meeting, and you can provide 2 minutes of oral feedback during the virtual meeting. And Spanish translation will be available for this meeting as well. So again, we encourage you to register in advance at the californianature.ca.gov website. And now I will turn it back over to Jen to provide an overview of the advisory committee and introduce the co-chairs.
Thanks, Debbie. So as mentioned earlier, the purpose of this advisory committee is to provide constructive feedback to the state from a diverse group of leaders on innovative, ambitious, and tangible means of achieving the goals of the executive order and for achieving 30 by 30. This advisory committee is not intended to supplant public feedback. Really, it's to set the table and get you thinking about what are some of the issues that we grappled with. They're going to grapple with them, get you thinking about how to frame your comments. This is a really august panel, but the public input is just as important. So it will really complement what we expect to get over the next several weeks. And every time we create one of these panels, we always know we could have chosen so many different kinds of people to be here. And because there's just tremendous expertise across the state on all these issues. We selected a diverse group of individuals with regional and statewide expertise and representation. We looked for people that had really experience in public life, who had sort of dealt with thorny issues in the public sphere and could sort of relate to what we're challenged by. And I really want to thank each of them for participating, and I really look forward to today's discussion. With that, I don't want to cut into any more of their time. We want to hear what they have to say. Let me introduce the co-chairs, and they will introduce the rest of the committee. So John Jarvis, former director of the National Park Service. Thank you for being here, John. And welcome Effie Turnbull Sanders, our other co-chair. She is the Vice President of Civic Engagement and Economic Partnerships at the University of Southern California and Environmental Justice Commissioner of the California Coastal Commission. John and Effie will introduce the rest of the committee. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Jen. And again, I want to pass my compliments on to you, Wade, Mark, and your entire team for the really extraordinary work in building the draft Pathways document, all the public engagement that you've already conducted. So we're off to a good start. So I'm going to introduce the first group of our advisory committee. We have David Ackerley, who is the Dean of the Rausser College of Natural Resources at the University of California, Berkeley. We have Christopher Cabaldon, the Mayor in Residence, the Institute for the Future and Senior Fellow at the Center for Digital Government. We have Michael Camuñas, President and CEO of Monarch Global Strategies, LLC, and Emmy Katani, the Principal at Katani Farms, LLC. Next slide.
Great, thank you, John. I'll take the next slide, and thank you for the opportunity to serve on this body. It's been a wonderful experience thus far, and I want to echo John's sentiments, Ms. Norris and Secretary Crowfoot and team for putting together the draft document, which represents a number of hours, and also thank the public for contributing. Additionally, on our committee, we have Stacy Corliss, who is a member of the Board of Supervisors for Mono County, and she's also the chair there. She's also on the Rural County Representatives of the California Board of Directors. Antoinette Cordero, who is a retired environmental and cultural resources attorney. We have Steve Gaines, who's the Dean of the Donald Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we also have Frankie Myers, who is the Vice Chairman of the Yurok tribe. And with that, I think we will move into the first theme. So as I think Ms. Norris mentioned, as the members of the advisory, as a member of the advisory committee, we are not here to be overly prescriptive. We're here to spur conversation, to help to reinforce the 30 by 30 goals, and also to, as Secretary Crowfoot mentioned, to help to improve this process through obtaining public comment. And just want to remind those who may have joined the meeting a little bit later, we will be having another meeting on the 1st of February to have more extensive public comment. So I think for the first theme that we're looking at, we're really looking at the recognition of Indigenous stewardship and a responsibility to the natural world. And when I think about this, you know, we often have these kind of more sanitized versions around what truly has occurred in our country around genocide and around the actual theft of lands from Indigenous people who served as stewards for thousands of years. The history that we have in this country around this complex relationship has reverberations into the present. And we have addressed some of these issues around sovereignty, around participatory government structures. I know I've worked on some of these issues with the California Coastal Commission. They are thorny issues, but we have a responsibility to really think about what the challenges are from the past and how those continue to have reverberations into the future. And then what are we going to do about it, right? Are we going to continue to operate in a status quo mode? Or are we going to start thinking about how we might be able to carve out a future that really recognizes these challenges and looks at the true kind of nature of our relationships? I think we have in the conservation framework, we have some core commitments, including commitments to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We also have a section on strengthening tribal partnerships there. I think one of the things that I kind of reflect on is, you know, how do we extend this conversation throughout the entire 30 by 30 document? How do we think about more of a cross-sectional kind of approach and not looking at, you know, kind of pigeonholing this discussion into kind of one box? How do we capitalize on kind of really bringing to the fore the relationships that Native people have had for centuries to the land and stewardship, and bringing that knowledge, which should be at the forefront, potentially, in my opinion, of what we're doing today. So with that, I just want to, you know, open up the conversation to our advisory committee and think about, you know, maybe there are ways that we can contribute in a greater way to the 30 by 30 report in this kind of looking at Indigenous stewardship, our responsibility to the natural world, our place in it, and where does it fall within the framework of this 30 by 30 report, and how can we strengthen these, how can we strengthen our opportunity that we have to recognize Indigenous stewardship. So why don't I just open it up to conversation around this issue. Vice Chair Myers.
Yes, thank you. appreciating giving the moment to talk here. I did want to first, before I get going into this too much, just so the public's aware of part of these discussions we're having, I'll say I'm the vice chairman of the Yurok tribe and been involved in consultations and working in conservation and working with folks for the vast majority of my crew and my vast majority of my career. And I'll say in discussions that we're having here, individuals in the meeting, I think one thing that is very exciting for me that the tribes are being discussed right off the bat, and we're having conversations just like Effie just started out here. It's very, very exciting. And I think for most folks, if they're not used to the conversation about Indigenous land stewardship and management and consultation, having tribes be at the forefront of the conversation right off the bat and really tackling some of these difficult conversations immediately is very exciting. I think one thing that you should notice right off the bat is no one on this advisory board, when we start these conversations, flinch one bit. And I think that's extremely important because these can be difficult discussions, given the relationship that Indigenous folks in California have had with the California government and the vast majority of where we're at now based on it. But I think looking at the document, it's nothing is perfect, and there's still room to grow. But I think it's on a good start. I think there is a good path to really bringing some healing to tribes and really looking at Indigenous people as a part of the solution, as part of the process moving forward, as part of really bringing our traditional ecological knowledge to the forefront and having the discussions of how we can work collaboratively with our partners and agencies to really bring that holistic management back to California, which is what we've done for thousands and thousands of years. I think it's really important and key that we remember these kind of tenets of Indigenous mindset. And one is that we are a part of the world around us. We are a part of the world, and conservation of this land is conservation of ourselves. We don't survive on this world without the world around us. And we need to really change that perspective that this isn't just here for us to take, but we're part of it. And as nature heals and as we look towards balance, I think we'll really start to see a shift in our communities and a shift in kind of the global outlook of climate change as well. One of the core tenets of Yurok belief system is that humans are here, Indigenous people are here, humans are here to bring balance to the world around us. That the idea of there being a wild or wilderness didn't exist in this country ever, that the world that folks saw when they first came here to California and its abundance was a world that was holistically managed and conserved as a part of that mindset, that we're here as humans to bring balance. So it's really, really, really exciting for me as an Indigenous person to hear these conversations happening at such high levels in which such a vision really pushing that mindset forward, that really it is our responsibility as human beings to bring balance to this world and to participate in the world around us, right? To be involved in it, to get our boots dirty and get our hands dirty and be out in the wild. And I think, the conversations and proportions to make sure that there's access to those is extremely important. I think there's a part of every human, there's part of Indigenous people that they need that to become whole themselves. We need that as individuals to become whole and balanced. And I would say that we're looking at the supplemental documents and what we've been engaging and looking at as far as the implementation plans are fantastic. I think the other thing is, I want to make sure that we're also open in looking at our pathways to improve it. I think there's definitely some room that we can even push it further to make it extremely, extremely accessible for all folks, and really to give a sense that this is an open space for tribes and Indigenous communities to engage, and that our voices will be heard. And I think it's good to see that. I feel really empowered by this group and by the pathways so far, and I feel like we continue this work, and I'm really hoping that my Indigenous brothers and sisters out there will engage and look and see this as an opportunity for us to really get back to who we were as a people and who we are and engage as a people. Many times when conservation is talked about in in Indigenous lands, we're often left out and we're often put to the side. And as Effie said, we're often put into this very little narrow box. And we've seen even in California, some conservation plans actually exclude us from the land and exclude us from the conversation and leave tribes out of the engagement. So it's refreshing. And I think we believe in good medicine, right? As people, you practice good medicine, you work in a good way, you work towards balance, you live a good life, and you work towards restoring land. And that creates good medicine. I definitely see that concept in this plan. We're working towards balance. We're working towards sustainability, working towards conservation, with conservation being this kind of concept that's inclusive, that looks as Indigenous people as assets and not burdens, that looks as communities as being a part of the solution. So it's, I just want to say those few words. Thank you, Effie and John, for giving me a minute to speak here.
Thank you, Vice Chair Myers. I think just as a follow-up to that, there's been a lot of talk around restitution, land back movements, and thinking about solutions that really provide opportunities for tribes to take a more active role in land conservation with land back efforts. And so I just wanted to see if there was anyone on the committee that wants to speak to that as a potential opportunity, perhaps even even within this 30 by 30 framework, as we think about justice and restitution. And I see Antoinette Cordero, I see your hand up.
Yes, first I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Antoinette Cordero. I'm an enrolled member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation. My ancestral village is Siuktun, which is on the beach in what is now known as Santa Barbara, California. And I also would like to express my gratitude to the governor and to Secretary Crowfoot for expressing openness and inclusiveness on this issue, and in hearing from everyone and their efforts to make sure that we are actually able to reach out and provide an opportunity for all voices to be heard on this vitally important issue. I would also like to echo much of what Vice Chair Myers just said. I think he expressed that very, very appropriately. So thank you. I would like to go a little bit beyond that and say that I think 30 by 30 is an opportunity for us to not only think outside of the box, but to recognize that the box is of our own creation and it is not serving us well, has not served us well. It's seeing human activity from the rest of the natural world is very artificial, especially from a native perspective. As Vice Chair Myers said, we not only believe that that we are part of the natural world, but we believe that the rest of the natural world is part of us. And so there's no, I was just recently on a call about the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary designation, and someone spoke about that we were anthropomorphizing the ocean by referring to it as being unhealthy. Well, the ocean is, we talk about the ocean people and the water people, the air people, that they are not separate from us. And that kind of thinking, I think, has been one of the things that has led us down this path and why we are having to have conversations like the one we're having today about how to save ourselves from our own misguided actions. So I do want to say that I think that 30 by 30 is just this wonderful opportunity for us to kind of think about reorienting the way we think about the natural world and our relationship to it. And that takes us back, of course, to tribal approaches and historic and traditional approaches to our relationship with the natural world. And I'm sorry, Abby, to get back to your original question, why I think it's important for us to be talking about not only co-management, but land return. And it's partly restitution. I mean, we all know that the lands were taken, stolen in many cases. And I hope everybody is familiar with the fact that, there were 18 treaties that were signed, but never ratified, but the lands were taken anyway, even though the tribes did not receive their promised compensation as part of that. And it was, a deliberate, very deceptive act on the part of the California delegation to Congress. So we have there's a lot to be recompensed for, but it's not just a matter of compensation or restitution. It's a matter of recognizing that there is a better way, and that better way existed long before the state of California existed. And we need to get back to that better way, but not just by tapping into and hopefully not appropriating traditional tribal ecological knowledge, but by actually returning some of this land to the tribes from whom it was stolen. That actually will not only further the cause of justice, but also further the cause of conservation and natural and protection of nature. And unfortunately, although the notion of tribal consultation and tapping into traditional ecological knowledge is reflected a lot in this document, the document doesn't really go, in my view, doesn't go far enough in terms of encouraging us to try to find appropriate places where returning land to its traditional stewards can actually happen, and where are the best places to try to make that happen, and what are the best methods for trying to further that goal. In fact, this document doesn't come right out and establish that may be in fact one of our goals. And so I think we need to be we need to go further on that. I strongly encourage our public members, to weigh in on that. Let us hear from tribes, especially, who would like to further that discussion. I think we have, as Vice Chair Meyer said, I think we have a receptive audience here, at least one that is willing to listen to those and have that conversation. And so we need to really make the most of that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think just following up on that, if there are tangible examples of where this may occur around land back and land restitution, that may be helpful as a guide forward to be included in the 30 by 30. Often we talk about things generally, but I think there may be some specific examples of that. So I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Myers.
No, absolutely, Effie, and I just wanted to tag on as well. I think there are absolute perfect examples, and some recently of lands that have been transferred over to NGOs for conservation. And I think taking that extra step that includes the tribal input and really remind ourselves that regardless of where we're at in California, we're all within tribal lands. Whether you're talking about creating a new park in LA, or a new conservation area in Eureka, that's still tribal lands, and there's still opportunity for us to make those connections in a real, tangible, very specific way. And I think encouraging this board and the pathways to really recognize that throughout whatever the implementation process is or project we're working on, there's always an opportunity to really recognize the land and work with local tribes to include them in the process. And I think those are some of the things that we're really going to need to move forward and really make sure are included in this pathways document everywhere throughout it, regardless of what the implementation strategy is. That there's a tribe, there are people there that we're connected there. If we're talking about opening access and creating parks and conservation areas, I guarantee you anywhere that there's a tribe who's interested in being a part of it and connecting with it. Recently working in my neck of the woods up here in Humboldt. changing the name of Patrick's Point State Park to Sumig State Park just because of that connection. I think there's many instances throughout California where a little extra effort, one more step to reach out to tribes could make a good project a phenomenal project and really make a lot of wrongs right. And I think one of the things that's exciting about this document is you can really see where we're heading down that way to make the little extra effort, to make that one extra little thing that needs to happen, to include the tribes, to include Indigenous people, to include that into it. That makes a great project a phenomenal project and really heals across the board, and then really adds value to the whole system. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have about one more minute, and Vice Chair Myers, I'm wondering if you might just, for the public's sake, maybe just expand on the Blue Creek Salmon Sanctuary project, potentially as a specific example, and later I think we can revisit that. But just if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more about that, I think that would be very illustrative.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great example. So several years ago, the Yurok tribe started working with some California partners and nonprofits, Western Rivers Conservancy, to take one of the areas that we hold sacred to Yurok, the Blue Creek. It's a part of our World Renewal Ceremony. It has prayer sites in it, and it was previously owned by a timber company who had pretty much had the same plan for the next 50 years that they had for the last 50 years, which was timber harvest. And we were able to work together in collaboration with NGOs and the state to find funding to purchase the land and actually work to engage the tribe, Yurok being involved, to create a salmon sanctuary that met both needs that the NGOs were looking at, but also the spiritual needs of our tribe and our members to be able to have access to our prayer sites, as well as healing the land and changing how we were looking at that watershed, and really to create, which we are on the path to do, creating new old growth forest up here in Humboldt and Delaware County. So I think that's a really good example, one that we could look of how working in collaboration with tribes really can bring a lot more to the table and really take a straightforward conservation idea and really make it much more than that. And I think that discussion that we're having of looking at conservation differently and making sure it's inclusive is one of the things that we did with the Blue Creek Salmon Sanctuary. We now have a place that is protected for our salmon runs and for our ESA listed species, and for us as well as Indigenous people, right? It's our habitat as well, and it's protected for us. And it also meets the goals of the conservation groups that we're working with. So I think it's a good example, and I think one that could be shared and replicated throughout California.
Thank you, Vice Chair Myers. I think your comment about the definition of conservation leads in nicely to the next discussion. Before we go on to the next subject, I just did see Antoinette Cadero's hand risen, so I just want to allow her the opportunity to weigh in one more time before we transition.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to follow up on something that Vice Chair Myers said, and that is, I think it's really important for us to recognize that 30 by 30 needs to be integrated into all of our other efforts that we are engaged in, and not segregated out. So not think about it as only an environmental or conservation effort, but also think of it as how it can contribute to all of these other efforts that we are making. Salmon, for example, cultural and access, but also, for example, the California's efforts on just transitioning from an extractive economy to a cleaner economy, and how we can do that in a just way that doesn't leave behind, that protects not only the workers from those old economies, but also protects frontline and fence line communities and creates a more just economy. So these things we need to make sure that we are thinking holistically as we go forward on this, and how it fits into our other objectives that we're working on in economic areas and culture and cultural resource areas. That was my only comment. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Turning it over to John.
Thank you, Effie, Frankie, and Antoinette. Really great comments. I want to make a broader comment about the committee too, for the public that's listening here, is that we were not intended to come to some sort of consensus document and make a specific set of, collaborative, well conceived recommendations. This is a group of individuals with deep insight and deep opportunity to say what they think. And so I want you to understand that we're here as representatives of our own individual experiences and thoughts, and giving that openly to CNRA. So the second theme, which feeds really well off of this introduction from Effie, is about how we define conservation. And Jen Norris did a very good job of explaining the discussions they had around the definition of conservation, that needed to be defined in a certain way so that lands could be counted. And at the same time, recognizing that there are all kinds of lands in California under all kinds of management that contribute to conservation of biodiversity. They provide access to the public to nature, and they have components of climate resilience. So the discussion we would like to have is how you be more inclusive in this Pathways document to recognize the contributions of these lands to this overall set of overarching goals around biodiversity, access, and climate. And so perhaps helping CRNA create some sort of criteria or some way to recognize the multiple contributions of working landscapes, urban spaces, and others to this. So I've asked a couple of folks to sort of lead off on this discussion and provide their input, but I really want to have an open discussion. So I'd like to Dean Ackerley to kick it off, and then we'll work through a few other folks.
Thank you, John. And I want to echo the thanks to both to participate and contribute in this committee, and also to the extraordinary work and efforts that have gone into the Pathways document so far. And we know in so many ways that California's leadership has national and global implications, and what we do really is important and beyond our borders as well as inside our borders. And I also want to really thank the previous discussion. I just so appreciate how deep and rich this discussion is about the people involved, about the role of tribes. And what it made me think of is that conservation fundamentally is a set of relationships. It's relationships between people and nature, and it's relationships between each other, between ourselves. And I think that is all part of what we're discussing. I was really struck at the beginning when Deputy Secretary Norris, she showed the cover of the report. And I looked at that cover, and it's like, that's the image, that's success. And if you look at the cover, it has some mountains in the background, some open space, undeveloped. It has some agricultural lands, it has some residential, and it has some people walking through a park in front. And that is a picture of success. And I think what I see here is, I'm going to talk a little bit sort of narrowly about the definition of conservation, but the reason is that conservation is many things are involved in conservation as a discipline, as an effort, as an investment, and in terms of what success looks like. 30% is like an anchor. And I had this image of it being like we're all being buffeted in this storm of climate change, social justice, all the goals we're trying to accomplish. And the 30% is an anchor in this storm, but it is not itself success. It's a tool, it's a metric, it's a tactic to get to success. And I want to actually offer, is my own thought here, that a very small language change might help here, which is to say, we're not trying to redefine conservation, because conservation is a big discipline. Maybe what we're doing is defining fully conserved lands and waters, or core conservation lands and waters. But I really hope that we don't talk about all the other lands as not conserved. And I will say it would pain me a little bit to see not conserved on that graph, because when we think about a regional park, well-managed multi-use lands, and we can all discuss in detail the multi-use lands of the federal and state government, they do contribute. They are absolutely part of conservation. Now, really briefly, there's three different, at least I see three important ways they contribute. This is familiar ground for many people. Now, one is that a core conservation area, if it becomes an island, will not succeed. So, imagine, and do this thought exercise. If we said that our goal was 30% conserved and the other 70% was paved over, in a parking lot, I don't think we would consider that success. And so it matters what's around those core areas. So that's just part of succeeding. Is it really, the wildlife corridors, these buffer zones, areas where wildlife can move in and out, those are important. A second thing that's distinct is some of these lands that are used for multiple purposes have incredibly important biodiversity value. Even if we focus on biodiversity, so we know that working lands can support very important biodiversity, and maybe we won't ever consider them part of core conservation lands, but they are part of success. And the third is I do worry that the governor has set us three goals. And climate resilience and access and biodiversity, and to fully embrace that, we need to fully embrace many facets of the landscape. And again, the core conservation lands are an anchor, or they're a target around the biodiversity. But we won't accomplish climate resilience, we won't accomplish the access goals if we narrowly focus on those, on those areas. And so maybe it's just some small changes on language that can, because a lot of this is in the pathways document. I'm not saying things that aren't there about restoration, about stewardship. There's many components, but those are bigger. They're bigger than the definition, and I don't want the definition to get in the way. I worry the definition will actually get in the way of what we're trying to do if it becomes a narrow focus. So I hope with some language and some, thinking about how it's written, we can see it as as a target, which is what it is, but as a tactic and as a means, and also as only one. It's also not done. We may not stop at 30%. Where will we be in 100 years? We don't know. So we also want to make sure we see it as, it's our 2030 goal, and we don't know what our landscape may look like in 50 or 100 years. So I'll just stop there, just to open up that discussion about what does conservation mean, and how does that 30% of core conserved lands fit into it. And I hope the Pathways document can provide a really rich foundation to make sure no one's excluded. I think that would be not an outcome any of us desire, is if some landowners or agencies or others look at their lands and say, oh, we're not inside, so I guess we don't matter. So we're not part of this. And that would be, of course, a loss to the whole community. So just smoothing out that definition in ways that really brings people to the table and doesn't leave anyone thinking that they're not at the table in this great discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Stacy, I would love to hear your thoughts coming from a rural part of California with working landscapes, how you see this definition and how these lands are contributing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to also offer my congratulations to all who contributed to this incredible document and this effort, and my gratitude. I'm honored to serve on this committee and be a part of it all. This is such an important effort. As I'm up in Mammoth Lakes in Mono County. And I see every single day here, the more than ever, the need and desire of Californians to connect with nature and see snow, experience the mountains. It's so meaningful, and so conservation is so important. And I'll get to how we maybe could talk to the folks who are actually out here learning and experiencing a little better. I really took note, Jen, when you used the word agonizing to describe the process of trying to wordsmith a concise definition of conservation for this document. And I really want to respect that. What a challenge. Coming up with a definition for the purposes of 30 by 30 means necessary limitations. And so that means things are left out. And so really, to many stakeholders, we've heard already from a tribal perspective that this traditional, or as David said, core conservation measure leaves people out. And early on in the Pathways document, there is an acknowledgement of some of the shortfalls of traditional conservation. So the challenge is, how do we address these shortfalls? How can this effort be inclusive, but also maintain the durability? That word is in the definition. How do we move out of this binary mode, protected, not protected, conserved, not conserved, to, I really think, a more holistic understanding of humans' role in the natural world that that Frankie described so beautifully. How do we get that into this definition? I hope people are really thinking about that. But if we, have to have a definition, if we use the existing core definition that's there to achieve the goal of 30%, what I would encourage the state to do is really to take an expanded adaptive approach to really empower those who have in the past been marginalized, and to engage those who don't see a role for themselves in conservation or who feel shut out. I hear this a lot, kind of on the local government level in rural counties. Let's try to make connections, demonstrate this interdependency between conservation and sustainability, really for urban, suburban, and rural Californians. One thought I had, do this by engaging people who are already invested in, for instance, the agricultural community, farmers, ranchers, and people who use the lands and waters, like the visitors to Mammoth Lakes. But I think especially, this is the California Natural Resources Agency leading this effort. So I think of the constituencies, clients, customers that you might call them, that exist within CNRA departments, such as state parks, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, people who get fishing and hunting licenses, just to name a couple. And of course, partners outside the agency, first and foremost, tribal partners, local governments, ag interests, tourism and recreation stakeholders, et cetera. By doing that, you can really frame this effort with places and issues that people already care about. If somebody cares about fishing, trying to engage them and to figure out better how they could get involved in the 30 by 30 effort. Let's try to have this. So it's great news, first of all, that 24% of, and I'm up in the mountains, so I apologize to my coastal waters friends, but I think of lands and first and foremost. So if we only have 6% to go to reach this core goal, let's really work to expand that process and engage more people in it, so that this remaining 6% truly becomes common ground for people across the state. A way to build trust, to move beyond, as David described, to move beyond the core conservation definition to those lands and waters beyond the 30%. And I just want to add too, I really think through this process and this effort, California is leading the way for the federal 30 by 30 process too. So those are a few thoughts. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stacy. Steve Gaines, I think you had some thoughts on this topic from the past as well.
Yes, thank you, John. And I just want to say that I totally agree with the points that David and Stacy have made with respect to the definition here, and really the importance of broadening the equitable aspects of this in important ways. And to kind of follow up on Stacy, I want to make 3 quick points of some aspects of this implications of the definition and the way we're thinking about this conservation problem that I think are worth considering in the draft. And the first builds on Stacy's last point, which is this effort, at a rigorous definition of what constitutes conservation targets and conservation areas is exactly what needs to be done nationally and globally for similar efforts. And I think that this framework is a big step ahead of the state of these broader national discussions at the moment, particularly the kinds of equity and Indigenous issues that we've heard a lot about so far. And so with the refinements that we're talking about here, I think that this can be really a model for others to use as well. So that just as California set the standard for other kinds of environmental actions, for example, auto fuel efficiency standards in the past, this can be offered as a model for how to do national 30 by 30 commitments as well. And I think we should be intentional about creating this kind of a national and global model as part of this process. And I think that the draft so far is a great step in that direction. So a couple of other points and things that I think are missing from the draft and need some further discussion. The second point here is that the draft combines a focus on land and waters, but despite the fact that I'm a marine biologist, the waters component is almost entirely focused on salt water. And I think it really needs to include a parallel focus section and think about this from the standpoint of inland waters as well. And there are great connections for this proposed 30 by 30 effort on the freshwater side of things, which are, I think, distinct from issues of land acquisition and other issues that are talked about in the land side of this project, and connecting it with a variety of different efforts, such as freshwater fisheries issues, the protection and restoration of natural flows, for example, through dam removals that are undergoing in a variety of different areas, drought resilience from the standpoint of climate change, and a variety of other issues. And so I think these are ripe activities for integrating into this conservation effort. And I think so we want to expand this to include freshwater as another key habitat as part of this discussion, which ties in, I think, with all of the other kinds of social issues that we've talked about so far. And then my last thing is I think that the draft, has really thinks about conservation areas with a focus on areas to either protect what is currently there or to restore what used to be there. And for a huge number of human impacts on ecosystems, these are exactly the key questions that we need to be addressing and finding solutions to. But a big part of the issue we're talking about here in the motivation for 3030 is climate change. And for climate change, there's an added critical issue, which is facilitating the movement of species to keep up with the pace of climate change. And so helping species to move to new places will increasingly be a critical part of species persistence, even with aggressive climate mitigation that we can take at a global level. So for example, in coastal waters, our projections are that many marine species are going to be residents of new countries by the middle of this century. And so if species can't keep up with this pace of climate change, they have added risk of extinction. And although there are a couple of brief discussions in this draft about the importance of connectivity as a key component of this, of conservation areas and protected areas, the potential role of conservators to help species move is greatly undervalued in the current draft relative to their roles in helping species stay where they are. And I think this is an important issue that really warrants more critical attention as part of this process on the conservation side of the story as well.
Okay, thank you, Steve, David, and Stacy. We're going to pass it back to Effie to pick up our third theme here to stay on time. So,
thank you, John. So, I think one of the things that I think about a lot is how do we engage public? How do we engage the public in a broader sense, and not just kind of the same folks that will come to a public meeting, but how do we engage on a deeper way, and how do we make this 30 by 30 plan more relevant to a broader group of stakeholders? And we have a lot of action items in the draft report. I think there are over 100 items. We've received some public comment around how we implement those large kind of aspirational goals. And, I think I'd like to kind of parse this out maybe in thinking about how do we reach more non-traditional groups who may be able to contribute to the implementation of 30 by 30, potentially EJ groups to be able to capture some of their work to meet our 30 by 30 goals, looking at bottom up rather than kind of top down prescriptive approaches. And then I think another kind of piece of this is how do we develop a plan of action for the actual kind of implementation of the recommendation, and how do we think about, you know, moving that forward. So I wanted to open it up to comments around this kind of generalized, these two generalized kind of areas, and wanted to see potentially, you know, maybe Chris, Michael, or Emmy may be able to kick us off for that.
Sure, I get my, yeah, and first of all, thanks so much, Effie.
I'm sorry, I said Chris, it's Christopher.
Thank you. It's usually my last name that gets hacked, but it's, yeah. So I'm Christopher Cabaldon, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks, Effie, and the two co-chairs and CNRA and the governor for leading in this space. I just wrapped up 20 years as the mayor of the city of West Sacramento, and I've also been in this world as a Delta Protection Commission member, and I helped launch the YOLO Habitat Conservation Plan, and I chaired our regional COG when we were doing the blueprint that ultimately led to as the model for SB 375. But most of my time is not. Most of my time is in the pressures that lead to the need for conservation, housing, transportation, industry, and so I'm glad to be here to be able to contribute to connecting those dots, and to think about, and because of my role in City Hall, I'm very much focused on implementation. There's no long-term in City Hall other than there's not the next 10 years, or there's the next 10 minutes before a fire hits or something else happens. So I think the document is an incredible instantiation of such a huge amount of both science and public engagement and input and expert panels and everything. It's really impressive what's been prepared here. It would be a miracle, a religious level miracle, if it also was really deep on the implementation strategies at the same time. And I think this is an area where the strategy document can and has to be even more detailed and precise. I'm mindful that, the governor, when he describes the executive order, is very specific about what it's intended to achieve in terms of climate resilience, equitable access to nature, and protecting biodiversity. And then, of course, the dollars are themselves very specific, and they have timeframes around them. And I think the worst thing that we could end up with, which is a pathways document that is way up here, and hears and responds to and mirrors our more high-level values and objectives, but it goes no further. And then suddenly the grant applications come out, and people are like, "What happened? I thought we were up here, and now there's a grant application out that says if you have to meet these 16 requirements, and if you don't, then you're out. You're not eligible. Or here's the point structure." And you're like, why did that never come up during the pathways report? And so these are the kinds of issues I think, although they are granular, they're really important to us getting that right, so that the public engagement authentically translates into the actual implementation of the program. And this relates very much to the discussion we just had about conservation, because this is where I'm kind of struggling on the implementation side. The report is trying to have it both ways right now, to the points that the last panel was describing in terms of conservation in both a big and narrow framing. I read the report first before this committee, just as a local government person, and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. I see myself. There's parks here. There's trails. There's all this discussion. And then I read it again as a member of this committee. I'm like, wait, I'm not actually in there, because the definition really applies almost exclusively to actively managed, permanently protected, federally and state-owned often properties. There's really all the things that I thought were in are not going to be in when it comes to the money. They're just in for when we're talking about the values and the objectives. And that's not the intention here, but I think kind of teasing this out is really important, and why the conversation we just had. And I really, really appreciate what Steve said about corridors and species movement, and David's work on niche conservatism. And I mean, we can't simply, I think we see, especially in the urban areas, species do stuff that we don't plan for. And ecosystems and niches change in ways that we can't plan for. And so a lens that is just about conservation of existing or restoration of prior isn't going to get the job done in because it implies that we're not concerned about biodiversity. We're interested in bio status quo or bio nostalgia, and that in a climate change world is not a viable strategy. So. And if we're not looking at corridors and the rest of it, then the implementation partners that we might see emerge in local governments, in urban-based non-government organizations, really don't have a role to play. So I think this becomes a really critical question as to this definition, as to who then the partners are. I happen to think there's a lot of partners out there that can turn the dial in ways that the traditional conservation efforts alone can't do. So one example of those is the regulatory side. How do we use the regulatory mechanisms of the state, but also of regions and local governments to reduce the demand and therefore the price of those lands that we want to conserve? Right. So if we, and so efforts to reduce the footprint of urban and industrial and residential development while increasing its intensity and density are really critical to this work, both directly, but also in terms of making sure that whatever money is appropriated for this effort, that we are able to conserve as much land as possible. But that means a different set of partners. But those are partners that have never been called to this work before. And so I think regions, the councils of governments, the metropolitan planning organizations that are doing similar activities as part of the climate change efforts through ARB really could be important parts of this conversation as well. I think part of what we're grappling with is a question that itself is the wrong one, which is what is conservation? What is this singular question, the agonizing question that Jennifer and her colleagues have been grappling with? To me, at least my experience from the rest of the climate change work as a local official is there's no need to come up with a singular definition for all purposes. Let me give you an example. I'm looking outside the window of my work from home space. I can see a sculpture that was built next to an affordable housing complex in my neighborhood. That sculpture was funded with a public art allocation inside the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities allocation, which is inside the climate package. Now, there's no way that art installation is going to satisfy any specific metric around VMT or carbon emissions directly. Right. And you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want 100% of the dollars in the climate fund going to public art installations. But there are distinct programs within the overall effort, each of which has different definitions about what it is that the contribution is that we're expecting to be made. And so I think that it's not just that it's a binary, it's also that it doesn't need to be fully inclusive of everything, that it's important to recognize urban and equitable access to public space and open space and to nature and corridors and trails, but in a way that doesn't compromise, I don't know if I'd call them the core conservation, but for lack of a better term, that does not compromise the large amount of funds that should be going in that direction. So I think if we're able to think about how to segment that question differently, it opens up a wide range of partners outside of the traditional conservation space that have a lot to bring to bear in terms of this effort, including EJ and the non-governmental side, along with local governments as well.
Thank you, Christopher. And I see Michael Comuna's hand up, and then I want to get over to Emmy as well.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and just echoing my thanks to CNRA and all the great work that's been done thus far. I'm maybe a bit of an odd man out in this committee insofar as I don't approach this work from any traditional background with respect to conservation or environmental stewardship. I'm myself a former federal official, Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and I've done a lot of work in the international space, but I'm also a public company director and a trustee of the Packard Foundation, which has done a lot of terrific work in the climate change space. So, and finally, a key part of my identity is as a boomerang resident, which is to say somebody who left home and has since come back to raise kids in the Central Valley in Fresno. And so as a Central Valley resident, I bring that perspective as well. And in that sense, I wanted to just pick up on some of the prior conversation and touch on some of the very excellent points that Christopher's made in this topic. First, obviously, we've had a lot of discussion about equitable access. And I think that one thing I would like to just stress is that when we speak of equitable access, we also have to consider geographic equity. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that places like the Central Valley are really at risk, have historically been, not as included in maybe this discussion, because so much of the land here is federally owned. We've got these beautiful federal parks, national parks, but if you look at the maps that are provided in the report, very little public space, very little space for children to play, very few parks, very few conservation areas, so to speak. And I think we have to really be sure, as this report gets to final publication, that we take geographic equity into account as much as we take other aspects of equity. And I think the report would do well by recognizing the paucity of conserved lands in the Central Valley and being a little more specific about what we can do, and thinking creatively and broadly about taking a diverse approach, especially with public parks, urban parks, for the at-risk youth of and the future, really, of the state in this community. With respect to this specific topic about, that Effie's asked us to address on how we create diverse stakeholders, actually, my comments about Fresno are related to my general views, which is, I think the report, Christopher's correct that the report does an amazing job of cataloging a laundry list, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but this huge volume of possibilities and opportunities. But the actual implementation aspect of the report is perhaps weaker, and I think would be could be strengthened tremendously by giving more focus to more of a roadmap approach of what needs to happen and what are the specific roles of key stakeholders. And I'd like to touch on two non-traditional stakeholders. One is the private sector. I mentioned that I'm a public company director. I can tell you that when you want to see things happen, you just get the capital markets behind them. And I know that may be anathema in some quarters in these types of discussions, but keep in mind that public companies are under tremendous pressure to meet institutional investors' demands around ESG. And a big part of ESG has to do with climate change and how expecting and demanding that companies devote appropriate resources to to reducing their carbon footprint, to supporting conservation and other environmentally responsible measures. California, of course, is one of the largest shareholders of many public companies that operate in California through CalPERS and CalSTRS and some of the largest pension funds at the state and municipal levels. And I think that the report should think about how can we actively reach out to and engage the private sector and leverage California as an institutional stakeholder and an investor, and create opportunities for public-private partnerships to get the private sector engaged. If I can be candid, if environmental conservation is only thought of as an agenda item of the left, of the political left, or of conservationists or environmentalists, I think we'll be limiting ourselves unnecessarily. And there's so much more at stake. Everybody has to get in the boat. Everybody needs to pick up an oar. And I think the private sector has an important role to play. And I'd like to see the report speak more specifically to the opportunities for partnership with the private sector. Second, I'm also a trustee, as I mentioned, of the Packard Foundation, and I think philanthropy historically has had an important role to play in supporting a number of important conservation initiatives. The background of my Zoom here is Point Reyes, where the Packard Foundation has acquired a lot of property around the state to conserve. I'd like to see also the report speak to the role of philanthropy, and we have some large philanthropic foundations here in California, some national foundations elsewhere that are very committed to California communities, especially poor and under-resourced communities in our backyard. And I'd like to see the report lay out a little more clearly what the role and the ask of the private sector, the philanthropic sector, and of some of these other communities that are perhaps not traditional stakeholders in our work. So I'll stop there, but I think that we have a real opportunity to broaden and grow the constituency for conservation. We've talked about this already in the context of reframing how we view traditional conservation, making it more inclusive, reaching out to more diverse communities. Speaking as a Latino now, another element of my identity, there's so much, so often these things are not brought down and made relevant to communities where they live. And we need to help translate why this is relevant to so many Californians and to the future and to our children's future. And I think the report, while it does good at speaking to traditional audiences, could do a little better at speaking to perhaps some non-traditional audiences and broadening the base of stakeholders that can support this effort. Thanks very much for the opportunity to comment, Effie.
Thank you, Michael. And then I want to turn it over to Emmy. Do you have some thoughts that you might be able to share with us on these general categories? I know it's a really broad set of questions, but I think that we would love to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Effie. Yeah, and I'll just start by saying I'm really excited that the governor is taking this initiative and see some real opportunities to protect important lands and waters in California. I come at this question as both wearing an agricultural hat. My family's in the farming and ranching business, as well as a conservation hat. Been involved with some different environmental NGOs over the years. This question about implementation and outreach, I'd like to really stress the importance of rural agricultural communities, and that the CNRA think about strategy for working with and reaching out to those communities. I've seen some examples in the past where conservation efforts have fallen flat due to ineffective outreach to those communities, and also due to a history of, going back decades, but in small communities, people have long memories. Going back to some missteps that maybe happened 30 or 40 years ago, where some of our state and federal agencies approached conservation in these communities in maybe a heavy-handed or a less thoughtful way, and that we need to really work on rebuilding trust in these communities. One reason that these rural and agricultural communities are so important is that those are the communities that live in places where some of the important resources, biological resources, the habitats, the species, and the wildlife corridors that from a scientific and conservation perspective, we've really prioritized conserving. Steve Gaines spoke to the importance of climate adaptation. Well, one way to enable species to have places to go is to protect wildlife corridors so that those species can move north, can move up into higher elevations where there are refugia that can protect those species. But we need to think about working with the people that manage what we conservationists see as a wildlife corridor. Somebody else who lives and works that land may see that as a forest that they've been harvesting or a place that they've been using for grazing. And so how do we work with those communities to adapt, to think about things like conservation easements, or say working with the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service that may lease that land to them, and that we need to think about changes to the management of that land. These communities are often don't have other options or don't have many other options for supporting their families other than the traditional ways that they've been working the land. So how can we approach those communities, work with them, give them incentives to make some changes that that help us realize our environmental goals, but in a way that enables people to stay in those communities, to continue to be able to make a living and support their families. A lot of the communities that live in these rural areas are very low income communities. And we've seen with things like the takeover of the Malheur Preserve in Oregon, that some of these communities, when there isn't good outreach, will go to fairly extreme, they'll resort to fairly extreme methods to express themselves. So I think we obviously want to avoid outcomes like that in California. And I think the best way to do that is really to have a good outreach to these communities. One is to think about, who are the people there, use language to reach out to them that will resonate. And then also really to work with local entities, local people in those communities. So a lot of, there are local land trusts that are run by people who live in rural communities, who understand working lands. So I would encourage the CNRA to really think about, empowering those land trusts, maybe some capacity building. A lot of local land trusts in rural areas and ranching communities tend to be resource poor and just have a very limited staff. So, how can the state maybe help those land trusts work with their communities and have some more resources to do good conservation work? Also, when both state and federal agencies go into those communities, really think about working with local staff instead of like a person from Sacramento or on the federal level, somebody from DC. Work with the local agency staff that really knows people in those communities, and think about messaging that will resonate with people so that, that we can develop really good partnerships with those rural communities.
Thank you, Emmy. And to the panelists, just want to thank the panelists and our committee for providing such robust dialogue, and turn it over to John to see if you have any closing remarks before we turn it over to Jennifer and Mark.
No, Effie, just again, thank you to everyone. Really insightful, constructive, supportive ideas that I think can help CRNA and Jen and Mark and Wade really improve this effort and make it a success. I want to comment to the public that's out there watching that you've probably gotten all fired up and wanting to make your own comments. There is going to be a public meeting opportunity on February the 1st from 3 to 6 is an opportunity for you to provide your thoughts and ideas to the organization. And we will also, as a part of the advisory committee, be seeing some of those comments and continuing this effort. So with that, we'll pass it to Jen and Mark, and you can ask your questions. You can direct it to the full group or to any individual for follow-up.
Well, Mark and I flipped a coin and he gets to ask the first question, but I wanted to, before he does that, just say thank you so much to all of you for reading the document. It's long, I know there are pretty pictures, but I appreciate you taking the time to review it and give us your thoughtful input. It's so valuable to get this broad perspective. As you probably know, Wade mentioned at the beginning that I think we had 15 workshops. Thousands of letters came in, so we got all kinds of ideas, and yet still you managed to come up with things we hadn't heard before. So I really appreciate that you took the time and gave us your thoughts. They're going to give us a lot to chew on as we revise this draft. So with that, I'll let Mark ask the first question.
All right, thanks, Jen. I also want to echo thanks for everyone thinking outside the box. Obviously the effort that Jennifer Norris led in putting this amazing document together, covered a lot of ground and a lot of bases in a very short period of time, and really an unprecedented level of public meetings that occurred during the COVID crisis, and literally thousands of people participated in that effort. And what's amazing is, and this is so thought-provoking, is there was a lot of things I heard from this group that I did not hear from 15 meetings or whatever that number was. And so I really appreciate that sort of creativity. So with that, we had sort of best laid plans. You write your questions ahead of time and you think that's what you're going to ask. And I don't think it's this sorts of things I was going to ask, I don't think are the right questions. So I'm going to do a very much a thought-provoking question, which this group seems uniquely suited to handle. So here you go. So as you very strongly pointed out as a group, conservation discussions often focus on wildlands because of high levels of native biodiversity. That was something that really we heard in all three themes. And so the question that I have, having worked on these issues myself, when I was at UCLA leading the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, really looking at urban biodiversity issues, how would you like to see the 30 by 30 pathway treat open space and habitat in urbanized areas or at the wildland urban interface? And what are some of the best ways to increase urban open space and enhance access for all, to provide equitable access, at the same time as optimizing conservation measures for habitat, connectivity, and biodiversity? This gets to the questions, many of which you sort of brought up, about what counts as biodiversity. Does it have to be native, non-native? What if it's a small park versus a larger park? We heard about connectivity issues, those sorts of things. So I'd love to hear some discussion about that, because it really does cover all three themes. And anyone can take a shot at it.
John, I'm happy to. Oh, go ahead, Effie.
No, please, David.
Well, yeah, thank you, Mark. And I mean, one thought here is actually, Jen introduced the Outdoors for All and the climate resilience projects, and then 30 by 30 is overarching. There is a little tension because 30 by 30 is both the primary biodiversity document and the overarching document. And so this is to the open question of whether the best resolution to that is to simply say, this is mostly the biodiversity document, and there's going to be an Outdoors for All, and there's climate resilience, and the three together are 30 by 30. I mean, that is a different way to, in terms of accomplishing all three goals of the governor, because this does a beautiful job of focusing in on what those core conservation commitments are. And maybe it can't also solve all these problems of what urban conservation should look like in urban parks. So that's just one thought, and that I don't know where that would play out and what it would mean for you all in Sacramento. And then I just want to, this is not real, I don't think I'm fully getting to your question. I want to echo, I think it was Christopher's comment, that that housing strategies become a really important part of what success looks like, because in order to keep open space around urban areas, it also means how is housing addressed? Urban infill, high density, efficient use of space. And another question is whether, can those communities come to the table together with a joint vision of what housing looks like and what therefore the access looks like for people living in those urban areas, and then maintain that value. And maybe there's more that can be said here about those connections to where our Californians going to live. And
to that end, David, since I know you're in the Bay Area, and in particular, the San Francisco area and Los Angeles has gone to the point of looking at biodiversity indices and having their planning departments start using those to start making those sorts of decisions. Is that something that you favor, that you think sort of can help in the 30 by 30 discussion here?
I'm going to pass it to a mayor for that question.
What an academic punt.
Is that an invitation?
Can I just jump in before Christopher speaks? Christopher, you in particular, can we slow down just a bit so that the Spanish translators can hear us? I think you have a New Yorker gene. I'm gonna let you go.
I do. I can't be understood even without a translator in English. So I understand. I think you meeting people where they're at that level. So I think what's happening in LA and a couple of other places is very encouraging, and this is an opportunity to nudge more places in that direction. think where you want to be careful, obviously, is that the vast majority of places, whether it's the city of Goleta or a small tribe or a community-based EJ group, don't have the analytical or scientific capacity or resources to do the kinds of deep science biodiversity analysis, both of the present and of potential impacts from climate change. And so you're really trying to embed these notions, these values, these objectives in a way that nudge those processes without necessarily trying to create so much expectation. Okay, if your trail is eligible, but you must conduct a full species, a trait-based species assessment across the entire, various niches or whatever. You make it either so people don't participate, or they can no longer build the trail because it's too expensive, and you've gone in the opposite direction of creating equitable access because you've raised the price essentially of these projects so much. And so it's finding that magic. It's I feel like the EJ groups, when they called for this, like this public art program in the other climate pot, that was part of that magic. Okay, but look, we're just going to accept it's scientifically, wishy-washy, but public art we're convinced it will improve the livability and the attractiveness of high density affordable housing. That affordable housing will reduce trips. We do know that those reduced trips will result in reduced impacts to climate change. And so that chain of science and social policy was an important part of that, and not trying to say we're funding public art, but every public art project must raise awareness about the climate, and it may only use sustainable materials, and all of those things, which would have made it would have ended up being a boomerang into a counterproductive solution.
I wasn't sure. John, did you want to comment on something?
Yeah, I'll just make very briefly and then pass it to Frankie. That back to your original question. My vision is a much more integrated landscape scale approach to this, where you have highly conserved lands that are connected by corridors that are either utilization of existing corridors like rivers and restored rivers that connect to urban refugia and landscapes that serve multiple benefits all at the same time at various scales. And that if we think about this at a very large landscape scale, if you have both people and their activities and working landscapes and conserved lands that meet the strict definition and lands that have components of all these values at the time, you can imagine that it could replicate essentially a very functional ecosystem that is serving humans as well as biodiversity all at the same time. And I think that's the holy grail that we should be headed for. And 30 by 30 is a step in that direction.
I think it's a strong theme in that direction. Vice Chair Myers?
Yeah, I'll just add on to that briefly. I think on a little bit what Michael was talking about, and bringing on private corporations as a part of the solution to conservation, and looking at connecting our urban areas with our rural areas where there could be a lot of development and a lot of revenue generated from housing in different areas, and trying to look at the 30 by 30 as connecting those two, where similar to California's carbon offset program, you can think about exactly what Chris said, not just looking at building materials, but connecting communities and connecting those landscapes between the two of them, driving this idea that we're all a part of this world around us. And if we're looking at trying to build infrastructure within our urban areas, part of it is looking at the actual facilities, parks or trails, or planting native fauna, or planting and looking at facilities that actually produce, right, some sort of food source or some sort of biodiversity itself, and then those areas being connected with urban areas, right, and having some sort of process that connects those two, that encourages additional conservation areas, drives revenue to rural areas that may not have as many resources, and also connects them to a specific urban site, wherever it may be. So I just want to add that.
Jen?
I'll jump in. Effie, did you want to add anything more? Your hand is up.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I think in addition to the affordable housing piece and that kind of connectivity, looking at transportation corridors and looking at least in Los Angeles, more of lower income families use public transportation. It hasn't, in Los Angeles, we still are struggling with that connectivity, but looking at ways to have opportunities for families to get to and from larger open spaces, and looking at ways that we may be able to provide both passive and active recreational opportunities. So if you have active recreation, maybe there's also kind of an additional area that has more of a passive, kind of more areas for urban conservation, where habitat can flourish there, and making sure that we count that. Particularly in the pandemic, we've seen how important urban parks are to mental health, physical health, and well-being, particularly in communities where folks are bunking up with, multiple families in very small, close quarters.
Thank you, Effie. And what's interesting is the importance from an ecological perspective for biodiversity is the size of the park matters. And the same thing is for mental health is, these teeny little pocket parks don't really help in either one of those areas. So we have to be conscious of that. Jen?
Yeah, so like Mark, I had a lot of great ideas of things I'd bring up, but to me, the core, and I'm not sure I can articulate this because my head is full of so many ideas that you guys have brought in, but to me, the core tension and opportunity about 30 by 30 is it's so catchy, right? It's so easy to just it's a slogan, it fits, makes a great bumper sticker. And it's something that you say it and it's conservation and people get excited and they all want to be part of it. And at the same time, it comes from a place, and I think Frankie spoke of this and others did as well, the real need to heal our relationship with the natural world and to take care of our biodiversity, right? To go beyond, conservation in name only, right? We need to actually heal our relationship to the land. So there's, and so the 30 by 30 excitement and slogan, everybody wants to be part of it, but if it's everything, then it's nothing. So my question isn't really a question. It's sort of, how do you reconcile that tension? I'm thinking about political campaigns, right? They get their slogan and it makes it easy for people to rally around, but then people all pile on the things that they want to add to that. How do you navigate that, those of you that have run for office? How do you sort of maintain your core values while making sure you bring as many people along as possible while not losing sight of the things you really want to get done? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Oops, we're out of time.
As an obvious not politician. Because I think that's the tension. And, I've said to a lot of people privately, 30 by 30 is like this bucket into which all dreams are poured. Everybody wants to be part of it. But then if it's, like I said, if it's everything, it kind of loses its punch, Come on, someone help me. How do you do it?
I have a quick answer to, I think for 30 by 30, one of the key concepts, and this word is in the document several times and was mentioned today, is stewardship. And in your definition, you have, I think, the word managed, but that's stewardship, that's ongoing care, that's an ongoing connection, and building connections and relationships between people and places that, an area like a national forest, like the one that surrounds my home, isn't just a place where I can sort of extract fun from and maybe some mental relief, but oh gosh, if I live in parts of Los Angeles, this is also where my water comes from. This is have an understanding of the Indigenous people of this area, the original and current stewards of the land, and building a deeper connection. So stewardship, that's the way you do it. One way you can do it.
I like that. Anybody else? Come on, I could not have stumped this
No,
committee.
I'll jump
There's
in.
no way.
I'll jump in, Jen, with a chance to get it wrong. I mean, I think that it is a marketing opportunity, and that's a good thing, because it has the potential to be sustained over political changes and pandemics and other things that are going to happen between now and 2030. That's great. You got some power behind it, and there's nothing wrong with it being pretty broad. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that there are buckets within this that can satisfy and respond to various sectors of our society, including the hardcore environmentalists, the environmental justice community, the Indigenous community, and where you need to look as to where that resonates, where it fits, without drawing too hard of a line, because there's going to be a gray, crossovers between all of those. But use 3030 as your sort of point of the spear to be able to move this thing forward, I think is good. And I think the challenge is, like you said, you want to be able to count, but I think counting is just one part of the overarching 30 by 30 initiative, which is really in a way encapsulates these three major goals, which is biodiversity conservation. 30 by 30, if you only do 30%, you have not conserved biodiversity in California. And if you only do 30% of access to the public, we have not achieved that either. And the same thing with climate resilience. So it really does have to be broad, but I think we can work on the definitions of what is considered part of this overall contribution.
I see Frankie wants to speak.
Yeah, I'll go. I'll say this to preface it. This is my second term as the vice chair of the Yurok tribe, and what they told me the day after the election is I am the first vice chairman to ever be reelected, and so a bit there. And so when you ask the question, how do you keep your integrity? I thought, shit, yeah, like, how did I do that? Like, did I do that? Did I make it? Can I answer this? Did I actually keep my core values? And I think a lot of that does translate that, right? And I think for any elected official, when you first get elected, you get elected on hopes and dreams, right? And I think that's the stage we're in now. What you plan to do, your big dream of what you're going to get done. And we're right in that stage, and how you keep it moving on to get reelected or to move on. I think there is some. I think we should look at running a couple of these through the gauntlet, right? Some specific projects. We're close to getting a draft done. Before we get to 100%, let's put the rubber to the road and throw a couple specific scenarios out and see, does this work before we finish it, right? Does this, have we shotgun this too much, and are we not getting anything? Do we need to narrow this down? So I think, and I kind of did that myself, right? So as I was running again, did I do those things that I said I was going to do, and then I did them specifically. The specific things I said I was going to do, did I do them? Did I accomplish any one specific task? I think that might be something we apply to this is to true it up before it's done, either hypothetically or not, and see, does this make sense in Mono County? If we put some properties and looked at it, does this make sense? Does it make sense in Sacramento? Does it make sense in Chumash territory? That's that would be my comment.
So I don't know how this happened, but it's 5 o'clock, and I think the Zoom genies will kick us out of the screens. So before that happens, Debbie, do I need to turn it back to you?
Just for a brief reminder about the opportunities for public feedback. So again, thank you so much to the advisory committee for your thoughtful ideas and insights and for the great discussion. Thank you to members of the public for joining and listening in. And as John Jarvis said, we really hope that this meeting has inspired you to provide your feedback on the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 document. Again, feedback is being accepted by CNRA through February 15th. A reminder of the ways to do so. You can go to the website and submit a comment form. You can send an email, snail mail, voicemail, and then also a reminder of the February 1st public meeting from 3 to 6. And again, you can find out more about that on the website. With that, Jen and Mark, any final remarks before we close?
I just want to say thank you again to the panel and to all the members of the public who stayed and listened. And yeah, we really are looking forward to your thoughts and feedback. Thank you to the facilitators. Thank you to the translator. I think we talked pretty fast, but I appreciate you sticking in. Mark, you have anything you want to share?
Nope, you covered it all. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.